MSNBC and CNN are biased.
Left-wing revolutionary channel.
CNN skews left, and MSNBC a little bit more left.
That right there is a lie. And if you've ever watched a minute of MSNBC programming, you may have bought it. And it's easy to see why. They feature liberal anchors in primetime slots, they cover stories that left-wing America cares about, and it's a perception held by both their own audience and their critics. But in this video, we'll examine how their reporting intentionally silences liberal voices and creates a completely different narrative from what you might think at first. Before we dive into the current state of MSNBC, we first have to turn back the clock to 1996, the year when MSNBC was birthed in a beautiful partnership between NBC and Microsoft. Ever wondered what the MS in MSNBC stands for? It literally stands for Microsoft. NBC at the time was owned by General Electric, one of the biggest corporations and government contractors. And Microsoft was in a fierce antitrust battle with the government, who wanted to break up the company because of its monopoly on desktop software. And no matter what you may think of MSNBC's political biases today, the network these two companies set out to create certainly wasn't trying to have a left-wing appeal from the beginning. Here's how MSNBC was introduced on its very first day of broadcasting.
From now on, the promise of the internet and the power of television become one. Because from now on, NBC News and Microsoft will revolutionize the way you get news.
MSNBC.
Despite the fancy promo, the first couple of years proved difficult for MSNBC.
Look at MSNBC. They are barely breathing. They barely have an audience. They barely have enough to rate an asterisk.
Their struggle to attract an audience even led former Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer to say that he wouldn't even have started MSNBC if he had known how difficult it was to get viewers. So for the first couple of years, MSNBC wasn't doing great. But then in 2001, everything changed.
Sean, it's me. I just wanted to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York. A plane hit the building or a bomb went off. We don't know, but there's lots of smoke, and I just wanted you to know that I love you always.
After 9/11, MSNBC became the minute-to-minute news arm of NBC, covering the aftermath of the planes crashing into the towers. And MSNBC, like many other news organizations, adopted a more patriotic tone in their reporting. They started to use the American flag in their lower third graphics, they featured more military personnel, and reported on the Army's latest tanks and weapon systems. This patriotic tone also led to a slew of new hirings. Conservatives like Tucker Carlson and Pat Buchanan were brought into the on-air fold at MSNBC. And in the years following 9/11, these pundits and journalists started to cover what would eventually become one of the most impactful geopolitical decisions of the early 2000s.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
In the build-up to the Iraq War, MSNBC, like many other publications, were, to put it mildly, not very critical when the Bush administration asserted that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. This was quite convenient for the parent company of MSNBC, General Electric. Because they were a defense contractor and military supplier, GE stood to make billions from the war in Iraq. And coincidentally, it was around this time when MSNBC started saying goodbye to the few voices on the network who were critical of the war. One clear example of this is Phil Donahue, who was very much against the war in Iraq and critical of the Bush administration's plans to invade. His show was also the highest rated in MSNBC's primetime lineup at the time. Nonetheless, he was fired a month prior to the invasion, and his show was replaced with a countdown to the start of the war. And after he was let go, he wasn't shy to tell the world why he was ousted from the network.
They were terrified of the anti-war voice, and that is not an overstatement. Anti-war voices were not popular. And if you're General Electric, you certainly don't want an anti-war voice on a cable channel that you own. Donald Rumsfeld is your biggest customer.
And a similar thing would happen to former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura.
I signed a 3-year contract with them. I was supposed to be on 5 nights a week, but there was a problem. After I signed the contract, we were putting the whole show together, it came out that I opposed the Iraq War, and I was never allowed on, basically.
And just like that, MSNBC went from being a channel with no brand or specific public perception to having a clear voice across all their anchors and reporting. They had found their niche. And they probably realized that people wanted to be fed the news they already agreed with, and perhaps didn't like their worldview challenged on the evening news. So how did MSNBC go from being a pro-war news channel to the left-wing outlet we perceive it to be today? Well, it may all be to the credit of one man.
And lastly, tonight, a special comment about lying.
During the mid-2000s, as the public sentiment on the war started to shift, Keith Olbermann's show became the most popular on MSNBC. And night after night, Olbermann would use his show to criticize the Republicans and especially the Bush administration.
Mr. Bush, at long last, has it not dawned on you that the America you have now created includes cold-blooded killers who will kill people to achieve their political objectives? They are those in or formerly in your employ who may yet be charged someday with war crimes.
And the popularity of his show presented a business opportunity for MSNBC. There was a large and underserved market for left-leaning cable news that they could capture. And so the rebranding of MSNBC began, using the same formula as in the early 2000s. Only this time they weren't targeting patriotic Americans, but liberals and progressives instead. Out went the conservative anchors like Tucker Carlson, and in came more liberal anchors like Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes, who had gotten their start on Olbermann's show. Gone was the American flag in their graphics, and the slogan changed from America's News Channel to Lean Forward. And suddenly, their promos sounded like this.
Progressive change takes time. Abolition would take a great civil war, but it came. Women's suffrage would take a crusade, but it became part and parcel of our democracy. Voting rights have taken a brutal fight, as will the case for marriage equality and equal pay for men and women. Liberalism always wins eventually, just as it did here in Philadelphia in the sweltering summer of 1776.
The changes at MSNBC also brought in even more progressive anchors like Krystal Ball and Cenk Uygur. But even though the audience liked them, they'd only last a short while. Because as Cenk would later reveal, MSNBC wasn't interested in being a truly liberal news outlet, but would just like to appear that way to their audience.
The reason I left MSNBC is I got a speech from the head of the network, Phil Griffin, who said, hey, look, man, I'd love to be an outsider. Outsiders wear leather jackets, they ride motorcycles, they're super cool. But this is NBC. We're insiders. And I was just in Washington. They're not happy with your tone. And we're the establishment here, and you got to start acting like it.
Although few people took notice at first, over the next decade, cracks would start to appear in MSNBC's liberal facade. As we enter the 2016 primary, Bernie Sanders starts to gain momentum among voters and in the polls, but not in news coverage. And MSNBC at this point in time has a stronghold on the average Democratic voter. Yet they choose to cover Sanders 20 times less than Donald Trump and half as much as they cover Clinton. And when his campaign finally gets coverage, MSNBC has some choice words for him.
Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl, and I can't even identify for you what exactly it is, but I see him as sort of a not pro-woman candidate.
This continues into the 2020 campaign, where MSNBC would continually show poll graphics with Sanders ranked in 4th or 3rd place, even though the numbers clearly show him in 2nd and 1st. Or simply misrepresent the poll results, showing he lost 5% when actually he gained 5%. This happened multiple times, and the harsh coverage from MSNBC would even be noted by other mainstream news outlets.
Tensions between the Sanders camp and MSNBC have been especially high.
This negative framing and dislike for Bernie Sanders completely erupted on air for MSNBC after Sanders won the primary election in Nevada.
No one else is as hungry, angry, enraged, and determined as Sanders voters. Democrats need to sober up and figure out what the hell they're going to do about that.
The happiest person right now, it's about 1:15 Moscow time. This thing is going very well for Vladimir Putin. I promise you. He's probably staying up watching us right now. How you doing, Vlad?
Largely people of color. Of those, the majority are Latino, and they are clearly, at least from eyeballing it, strongly in favor of Bernie Sanders, with Joe Biden coming in second.
The Sanders campaign and the Trump campaign, they've taken these things to dark arts of abusing the press, of bullying the press. I mean, what do we miss in terms of paying attention to a squeaky, angry minority and ignoring the majority?
I'm reading last night about the fall of France in the summer of 1940, and the general, Renault, calls up Churchill and says, "It's over." And Churchill said, "How can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over?" He said, "It's over." So I had that suppressed feeling.
After comparing the Sanders victory to Nazi Germany and the fall of France, the public outcry forced Chris Matthews to apologize.
Senator Sanders, I'm sorry for comparing anything from that tragic era in which so many suffered, especially the Jewish people, to an electoral result in which you were the well-deserved winner.
Despite several reporters being forced to make apologies like this one, Sanders wasn't the only candidate who would receive unfair coverage from MSNBC. When Andrew Yang ran for president in 2020, MSNBC didn't even bother to include him in their overview of candidates. This all culminated when MSNBC hosted one of only a few primary debates that year, which Yang had fought hard to be included in, but he ended up getting under 7 minutes of total speaking time.
You know, Wolf, all I can say is I miss CNN moderating these debates.
You got some of that supporters behind you, clearly.
No, I mean, they saw it last night, too. I mean, America saw it. I went 32 minutes without a question, and I was raising my hands trying to get a word in.
The continued negative framing of progressive candidates and issues has led many in independent media to speculate what MSNBC's true intentions are.
MSNBC is more like Fox News than you might think. They are both huge corporate profit-driven media channels.
It is really clear this is infotainment. You should take it as such.
When they're talked about in media as though they're progressive, there's not a progressive panelist on there.
None of them are meant to inform their viewers.
MSNBC is establishment Democratic, or you could call it center-left.
That's the media elite. They're just dressed up a little bit differently.
These people are liars. All they do is use hate in order to gin up ratings, in order to make sure that they can all make a lot of money.
And for the higher-ups at the network, that may be true. But for the journalists and producers working at MSNBC, the reasons for their biases may not be as sinister, according to former anchor Krystal Ball.
They are people. They're human beings who respond to their own self-interest, incentives, and groupthink. So it's not like there's typically some edict coming down from the top saying, be mean to Bernie. But there are tremendous blind spots. I would argue the most egregious have to do with class. And there are certain pressures, too, to stay in good with the establishment, to maintain the access that is the lifeblood of political journalism.
So what do you think? Is this really journalistic malpractice or just honest people living in a media bubble? Let me know your opinion in the comments.